Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Gabrielle Selz, a true child of the New York art world and a remarkable chronicler of her family members and the many lives they lived. Her father, Peter Selz, was a magician, a curator of modern art historian, conjurer of charm, seducer of artists and women, and an oft-married man. He cast a spell on everyone who met him. Her mother was both a lover of art and a writer, who for years surrendered her own ambitions to be a part of her husband's glamorous world. Gabrielle and her sister lived with the most extraordinary art on their walls, and throughout her childhood and adulthood, knew many of the famous and infamous artists who shaped the evolving face of modern art. And she writes about it all in her new book, Unstill Life, a daughter's memoir of art and love in the Age of Abstraction. It has just been published by W.W. Norton and Company. Welcome.
Thank you.
In the late 50s, or starting in the late 50s, for many years, your father was Mr. Modern Art. He was chief curator of painting and sculpture at MoMA. He created the Art Museum at the University of California, Berkeley. He curated art exhibits around the world, and he wrote books about modern art. That's how the world saw him. How did you see him as a child?
I don't really think well, even since I was a little kid, he would take me to look at art. And so I knew he was kind of the expert and the final word. He would take me into the galleries, and I would write on his shoulders, and I would call out the names of paintings. And we played at the Museum of Modern Art, but I understood that the way a child does, and I really didn't understand the glamour of that world until he left and we didn't have it so much anymore. And then I saw the contrast between, our life without my father and the life that he continued to build and live. So
now your father was a German Jew,
right?
Who I'm sorry,
born in Munich.
Born in Munich, and his family, with the rise of Hitler, his parents sent him here to New York to study. How did he first become exposed to art? Where did that introduction come?
I write about this in the book. He was kind of like the wild child, the youngest of three boys, and the child they never thought would amount to something. And his grandfather decided to take him under his wing and take him to look at art with him. And his grandfather, named Julius Dry, was an antiques dealer who also dealt with art, but mostly Renaissance art, and occasionally with an occasional modern piece. And so that was my father's initial introduction, was going around with his grandfather to museums. And then later on, after his grandfather died, and his grandfather died just as the Nazis were establishing their regime, my father was going to be sent here, and he went to see a degenerate art show, which was the art that had been labeled and banned by the Nazis for its loose moral values, and some of it was actually destroyed, quite a lot of it. And my father was really moved by these, German expressionist painters like Max Beckmann and painters like Kandinsky. And so he came over to this country, and he was sponsored by a member of the family, and they sent him to work in a brewery, and they finished he had 1 year left of high school, which he got to finish. And they brought him up to their apartment, and they said, what do you want to do with your life, Peter, now that you finished high school? And they thought he was going to say doctor or lawyer or something, and he said, well, I always liked, art. I'd like to do something in the art world. And they said, nothing's ever become of cousin Alfred. And that was Alfred Stieglitz, who was a distant cousin. And so my father then went and met Alfred Stieglitz at his gallery, and that was really his initiation into American art and to real modern art. And really gave him a grounding. Was just like he felt like he found a home.
So he finished private school. He dropped out of Columbia to
go into the Army.
Right, to go into the Army. And then he came back, and he was in school at the University of Chicago, where he met your mother.
Right.
What do you think drew them to each other?
They met at a faculty tea. I think they were physically, obviously attracted. I think he was charmed by her. My mother was quite striking and quirky. She was more of a dreamer. He was very grounded, I think, and ambitious. But she had a background in art history.
And she was college educated.
And she was college educated. She came from a brilliant family, a somewhat bohemian, colorful family, and I think he really liked that. She also, had a degree in English, and he wanted to write books. And in the very beginning, she edited a lot of his material. And so they could work together as one. And I think that was really important for both of them.
They married. They went to Europe when your father was working on his PhD.
Right.
And saw a lot of artwork all over Europe. How do you think, what kind of life do you think they envisioned for themselves at that time?
I don't think he was very ambitious, but I don't think he had any vision of like what was going to happen in his life. I think my mom didn't want to have children. He did. I think they felt like they could carry on like that and just build a life together.
With the love of art.
And maybe teach and be professors and maybe eventually have children. They were just really looking to make ends meet. And when before he ended up at MoMA, he was in Pomona where he got a job teaching, and that was the only job he could really find. And he basically took his dissertation and went door to door to universities. Nobody didn't have email then. And, talked to them and tried to get a job. It was really hard.
But he was one of the first people to write a dissertation
on modern art.
On modern art.
Yeah, in this country, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the first, actually.
I'm sorry?
I think the first.
Okay. So in 1958, he was offered the job as chief curator of painting and sculpture at MoMA. Mm-hmm. And he really kind of revolutionized MoMA. He felt that museums should show the work of artists who were actually alive and not just...
Well, MoMA felt that way,
What
too.
they are, okay.
That was the whole agenda for MoMA, and that was started by Abby Rockefeller. But what he did with MoMA was that he started to show things, that were bringing over a lot of art from Europe, which, the Museum of Modern Art didn't have that much, that showed the influences of modern art. And then also bringing figurative art, because they were, only showing at that point abstract art because it was at the forefront of everybody's attention. So he kind of mixed it up. He also felt that they should do all sorts of different kinds of experimentation. So he brought the tingly, exploding sculpture into the museum. And, it should be about things that were fun and not just serious. So, yeah, he did. And then he gave Rothko his first retrospective. Which
he really did champion the abstract expressionist.
Yes.
And Rothko seemed to be, was he, of all the artists, and your father promoted the work of many, many artists, but Rothko seemed to be really way up there.
First of all, I don't think my dad would call him an abstract expressionist, but more of an expressionist maybe, or an abstract artist, but he always sort of differentiated between abstract art and expressionist art.
Okay.
But I think he really felt, he responded to it on an intuitive level and felt it resonated with him. It was beautiful work, and it's still very beautiful, mm-hmm. powerful work. And but he also loved de Kooning too, and he wanted to do a de Kooning retrospective. So yeah, I think he really did connect though to Rothko.
So you and your sister and your parents lived in this, what sounded like a wonderful apartment on Central Park West. What were those days like? Your mother described it as that life. Yes. Those days. Yeah. And your father was at MoMA for 6 years. What was it like?
They were gone a lot. They were gone. They went to 3 parties a night, an average. Although that's what my mother said. I mean, it's hard to imagine that. So it was a very busy whirlwind life. They had parties at home. I remember, my mom is being very distracted when she was with us because she was always exhausted. I mean, she wouldn't get to bed till 3, and then she would take us out to the playground, and so she was always tired. And then evening would come, and she would dress up, and then she would go out the door, and she called it going off to the races, mm-hmm. and they'd go from party to party. And I remember my dad always in a suit, going off with my mother, whisking her away. He was home some of the time. When they were home, I remember that they were always, one or the other of them was always typing at the typewriter.
And you must have met a lot of artists.
We did, and the few children of the art world. There
Right.
weren't that many. But yeah, I mean, I remember the Rothkos, both Mark and Mel, very well, and their children, Kate and Topher, or Christopher. And so I remember them pretty well.
We're going to take a short break, and then I'll be back with more with Gabrielle Selz, author of Unstill Life, after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Gabrielle Selz, author of Unstill Life, a daughter's memoir of art and love in the age of abstraction. When you were 7, your parents separated. He went to take a job to create this new museum at Berkeley. How did this affect your mother, and how did it affect you?
Mom was devastated. She never thought, she knew my dad had affairs. Her father had affairs, but she could never imagine that he would leave his family and the museum.
Now, did he go off to be with a woman?
Well, both. He was given this opportunity to start direct his own museum in Berkeley, and he wasn't going to end up being the director at MoMA. So he wanted to go on a new adventure and start something different. My dad was an adventurer at heart, I think. And Peggy Guggenheim at that point was going to donate her collection of surrealist art to a museum that she was going to build in Venice and in conjunction with Berkeley, and there were going to be 2 sites for the Berkeley Museum. That didn't work out after Reagan slashed the budget. So it was a big dream. My mom went out with my father to look at Berkeley, and she just didn't want to leave New York. She felt like she had, given up enough of her life to move along, and she just didn't want to be, she really didn't want to be a museum director's wife, and she didn't feel like she was suited to that. And she didn't think he'd do it. She didn't think he'd really pull the cord. He met someone and fell in love with her, Norma, who became my second stepmother when she married my dad. He ended up calling her Nora. And they both divorced their spouses in a quickie Mexican divorce, like literally overnight, and went to the West Coast together. So when my mom pulled out, my dad found, another person to do it with.
Now,
and I was, I didn't think I understood what divorce meant, because this was back in the mid-60s, and there weren't that many kids in my private school whose parents were divorced. So I didn't envision it. I didn't know that, I felt like, oh, my dad's just going away on another trip. I didn't know he'd go on the other side of the country and live there, and I would see him a couple times a year, and that he'd have another family.
Now, sometime after your father went west, your mother, you and your mother and your sister moved to West Beth. Tell us about West Beth. And I had never heard of West Beth.
Oh, really? Well, yeah, it's down on West and Bethune Streets in the village, hence the name West Beth. It's the oldest and largest artist housing project in the world. It was built, it was opened in 1970, but the idea for it had begun to percolate in the early 60s. My mom and a woman named Ellie Frankfurter were hired to be the people who gave the first people their apartments, did the final selections. And so they were kind of like the final guardians at the gate and got to choose who got in.
They had all the power.
Yeah, no, but they hid it. They pretended it was this prestigious board made up of all these famous institutions, because they didn't want any backslash. And it was an artist housing project. Artists got to live in very reduced, with reduced rents in this beautiful space. 500 plus apartments, because there was no place for artists to live and work in New York at that point. That's still a problem, actually. It's an ongoing problem, to live and work inexpensively. And so half the apartments were designated for children. So therefore, all these women had children. My mom encouraged them to have children, because once they had kids, she could give them they could get bigger spaces.
Okay.
And so I've met some of those women who say they owe the fact that they have children to my mother.
So it sounded like it was noisy I don't know if bohemian is the word.
Well, it was kind of like, you know, a commune, except that everybody didn't, I mean, everybody was on top of each other. It was very colorful, the hallways. It was Richard Meyer's first building out of architecture school. And so it was very modern looking inside, ramps, passageways, psychedelic colors on all the walls, people in and out of each other's spaces. There was impromptu poetry readings and film series going on.
Somebody brought a horse to
Somebody had a horse living on our floor. There was a theater upstage. There were just, you know, and this was, you know, the end of the 60s, the early 70s, and it was that whole psychedelic kind of era.
And you loved it.
I loved it, yes, because I was so free and I wasn't alone. I mean, I felt I was surrounded by people. I was surrounded by creative people. I was surrounded by children. The, you know, the Village Halloween Parade, it started in West Bath. It's like was the kind of flavor of that place.
Does it still exist?
Yes, and some of those original tenants are there. And it's now a naturally occurring geriatric community because they've all aged in place.
Right. Right.
Merce Cunningham had the space on the top floor.
Okay.
And Dion Arbus was across our hall.
And she was there when she committed suicide, right? She lived there?
She was a friend of my mom's.
Wow.
She did.
Now, but you would visit, you and your sister would visit your father in California.
Right.
And that was a whole other kind of scene, right? Or was it similar?
Yeah, well, it was similar. I mean, I always think of both New York and Berkeley being very rarefied environments, and they're not like the middle of the country. So in some respects, that was there was a similarity, and you know, again, it was that era that you know, full of hippies and you know, unconventional activity. You know, he opened his museum with naked people rolling around on the floor to christen the building with their naked flesh on hard concrete. And that was the kind of thing that went on at West Bend too.
Oh, did it?
Well, but unknown to me.
Okay,
you know,
okay.
at the time. So I think in some ways, we saw more when we were in Berkeley what was going on with my dad and his world, because he wasn't used to having children around, and there was, you know, he had a house with no walls. It was all open space, and so there were no boundaries.
Your father would marry 4 more times after divorcing your mother, but he kept coming back trying to seduce your mother.
Yes.
How did that affect your mother, and how did it affect you?
I think in the beginning, when I was a child and my parents would get back together again, I would get very, very excited. And, you know, it would be Daddy's coming home and the family would be together. And I think we wanted that desperately. I mean, you know, most kids of divorce, that's their dream, is to bring their family back together. But I think after they would, you know, they would do that, and then they would break apart again, and we would then go through the whole same crash and devastation again. I think it got tiring, it got old, it got painful. I think we stopped, I stopped wanting it to happen. I just knew what was coming. I knew it was coming from my mother too. And it wasn't always his choice. I mean, there were a couple of times she backed out of it. But I think that they had some really mutual passions and a history together that was profound and that endured certainly through her whole life.
Mm-hmm. And I remember, I don't know which of his girlfriends it was, but there was one that he was planning to marry, and you said, "Don't marry my father."
Yeah, that was Deirdre. Yeah.
Because?
Yeah. Well, she asked that. She says, "How do you know?" I didn't even know. I just knew. I just knew that it was just going to crash and burn, you know, and that he's an adventurer, that he would, you know, the same thing that attracts him to the new art, you know, that's always happening and always going on, because he's always attracted to what's new. I think it's the same thing that pulls him into like new relationships.
Right.
I mean, it's this constant need to rediscover or to discover something new.
In that vein, you saw modern art go through a number of stages,
right?
You know, over the course of time. Talk about that.
Yeah, when I was a kid, you know, it had just, you know, I mean, abstract expressionism was all about getting much larger on, you know, on a big scale, taking the frame off the canvas, so there was no container. And I watched as all this art, you know, even came off the canvas then and leaped out into the world, and then, you know, started moving across the coast, and there were artists then doing things that were not even in gallery spaces or museums, but out in the landscape, like Christo. And then with the
wrapping things.
doing the running fence, which was like the longest at that point, longest piece of art in history. But I think it was 25 miles long or 27 miles long in Petaluma. And then with the advent of feminism, there was this whole growth of performance art, because performance art was sort of then, done a lot by women, and women were tended to do much more autobiographical work, and they tend to do performances about their own lives. And so we watched all that happen, and that happened a lot on the West Coast too.
And in between there was the kinetic art, things
there was
that
the kinetic was moved, and that was after abstract expressionism, and during it. And again, that whole idea that once abstract expressionism was all about like the movement and inner turmoil inside yourself on a canvas, and kinetic art was all about that sort of turmoil out in the real world.
And then, of course, there was pop art in between that your father didn't think much of.
My dad never liked pop art, but there's some of it that's really good. I disagree.
Now you got a degree, a couple of degrees in art history, right?
I have a bachelor's in art history, and I have my master's in writing.
Okay. Did you ever try to paint? Did you ever try to be an artist?
I actually consider writing a form of art. So I didn't paint. I did a lot of art, but mostly drawing.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I was actually always somewhat intimidated by all the intense artists.
I imagine
all around me. I always wanted to, get into the creative act in some way. That was just sort of like, it felt a natural decision and a choice for me. But I also saw how hard it was, how much rejection there's involved, what the struggle is like, how difficult it is to support yourself. Just all the issues.
Right.
So I had a love, I'm not going to say love-hate, but, I had some ambivalence.
What do you value most about the kind of life you had with your parents?
My early life, or the whole thing?
The whole thing.
I think that they introduced me to a lot of wonderful things, and I have an incredible education, and they were fascinating people. They were really, really interesting people. And I think they both, certainly my mother became a good parent as she, after we got older, and she sort of like, accepted the fact that she was a mother. And my dad's become a very caring, parent as he's aged.
And he's still alive.
And he's still alive, and he's still working. And the one thing I learned from my dad is all about persistence. He's the most persistent man I know. So I guess what I really value is their passion. Their absolute passion. And
what do you hope, we got about a minute left, what do you hope readers will get out of this book?
I just want them to be immersed in the story, the story behind all the pictures, and the whole panorama. And I want them to also, I love the love story in the book. There's a, intense love story in the book, and I think that's beautiful. So yeah, I want them to see both the glamour and the destruction of that world.
Well, I was certainly immersed in it, and I've never been one who has known much about or had much interest in modern art, but you have awakened.
That's good. That's what I hope. That's good.
That's great.
Yeah.
We're out of time. I want to thank Gabrielle Selz for joining me today. Unstill Life, a daughter's memoir of art and love in the Age of Abstraction, just published by W.W. Norton and Company. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.